Okay, so starting off, I was going to run through the articles that I found for our report, focusing primarily on performance-based budgeting. So for history, and we've kind of gone over this in the class, on Dong Sung 2005, he describes that PBB has come in a series of waves. Starting first in the 1950s, it was spearheaded by the federal government with numerous acts and policies that were put in place. The Hoover Commission, National Security Act Amendment, and the Budget and Accounting Procedures Act. And then in the second wave, it kind of departed and came back in the 1990s, again though, led by the federal government. The Chief Financial Officers Act, Government Performance and Results Act, and the National Performance Review. And then it's somewhat faded away due to its own complications. And he mentioned that there would probably be a third wave coming back, and this time in a more contemporary time frame. It would be based on solutions to the old problems and a greater use of technology. The old problems still existed, but the thinking with new computers and recording software, it might be easier to implement PBB. In Grisel and Pettijohn's 2002 article, they were discussing how everyone normally makes like a laundry list of effects when they're trying to describe a process. That, you know, A impacts B, which impacts C, and then just kind of this linear process. But a lot of processes we have in government aren't that simple, that this system dynamic model was necessary where you have kind of a cluster of different ideas and topics and programs, and a change in one kind of ripple effects across this web of programs and affects all the other ones. And one thing that I kind of caught on in what they were saying is that the staff perception of the implementation of a performance-based budgeting system made a huge impact. That if the staff felt they and their program were doing well, but another program that did poorly that wasn't being punished, well, it's like, well, there's no consequence, so why are we trying so hard? So there's just kind of ripple effect through the entire agency. The key example on this one was in Florida trying to implement performance-based budgeting in 1994, where there was this really unjust and kind of the staff was ridiculed by the legislative higher-ups, and it killed their whole implementation just on the perception from staff. Why does PBB keep coming back? The reason is, despite its own challenges, you know, where it has financial costs of implementation, the difficulty of choosing goals, time to train all of your staff, and no comparison between organizations, they were realizing that there's an accountability need and a managerial need for performance-based budgeting. So it's not necessarily a budgeting tool as much as it's a management tool, and how that's why it keeps coming back and being used over and over, that it's satisfying that need. So for two success stories that I found in Holy 1999, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, they had a long-term strategy. They had achievable goals. There's quality data collection and recording. And the results were the lower injury and fatality rates over a near 10-year period. So it was an example of everything that needed to occur and the effort put in to make sure that the program was successful. Same thing for the Chesapeake Bay program, where they're trying to improve water quality over so many years. They again had long-term goals. They brought all the necessary parties together. They had adequate training, and they had better water quality. So there's a 40% nutrient reduction by 2020, which I think was a 10-year program they're working on. So in the same article, it elaborates about the importance of training, that you need to train everybody when you try to implement performance-based budgeting. The line workers need to understand their role. The mid-level managers need to know how to interpret the data that they're collecting and how to effectively use it. And then the upper-level managers need training on making realistic goals and collaborating with all parties involved. And, the challenge of comparison, they're talking about I'm not going to pronounce it incorrectly, Yesowarning and Burgess, 2006, about the Veteran Affairs, the healthcare system, that the VA hospital system was so large with so many hospitals that trying to make one cookie cutter analysis system was ineffective. It was called VERA, Veterans Equitable Resource Allocation System, which they would try to score each hospital and then assign resources in the future. And the problem was some hospitals would handle a different severity of patients and costs, and some were more specialized for a certain type of hospital service. And this was really not being represented in the VERA system, so they proposed a new system for performance-based budgeting, kind of pinpointing how important understanding the entire process is and making good goals. And they proposed a new multidimensional evaluation system so that PBB could be applied. And then the final result was a greater information for the budget makers. So then I have performance-based budgeting as a dependent variable. So how Lunsford, Sides, and Jones in 2011, they were describing how performance-based budgeting seems to really work in a boom and bust economy. So if you kind of think of performance-based budgeting is sold as this process of more efficiency, but then there's kind of in reality what occurs, that performance-based budgeting is responding to economic pressures. It's a dependent variable. So in the boom years, it's kind of what we would expect. That is a bargaining tool for the budget and justifications. But in the bust years, when the economy was down, it was not used as a budgetary tool. The results of the performance didn't change budgets in the future. Instead, the governments had to look at what is most critical to their citizens. So if you had a program that you're working on that you're very proud of that was doing well, if it wasn't determined critical, you were going to lose your budget anyways. So even the high-performing programs would get cut. The performance-based funding, this is another one talking about universities internationally and how they choose their own goals and the impact that makes. So the countries were Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, United Kingdom, and the United States. So you can see here in the bottom right that they were able to come up with this 2D matrix between output-oriented research and input-oriented research, and then teaching funding between input and output. And then those are abbreviations for all the countries and kind of where they fell. And it showed that how they oriented themselves really described their own values. So Denmark was an extreme for both output-oriented for research and teaching, where they were designed around the credits completed by students. And then we had Germany, which, interesting, their school administrators were actually state-appointed leaders. So their salaries were paid by the state and were not part of their own funding, so that they were able to focus more on the input side. And then we have another example internationally. It did a comparison in Li and Wang's 2009 article comparing the United States, Taiwan, and the Guangdong province of China. So the part about the US was actually pretty standard. It's kind of what we already covered in class. But what I found interesting was Taiwan put in a performance-based budgeting system that was government-led. It was very well supported. They had long-term goals, but instead of just accountability, they were focused on the desire for spending control. They wanted to limit how much these programs were expanding over the years. And with all the support they put on, it ended up doing very well. China, on the other hand, tried to put in a performance-based budgeting system, but it was led by their finance department, so not the upper echelon of leadership, kind of one step down. It had moderate support, whereas pretty much the program managers who were interested in the program and kind of volunteered to be monitored were involved, and it was extremely short-term. Everyone knew this wasn't going to go through, so it kind of went, they gathered some data, and then just kind of fell by the wayside. There was no effort to continue it forward. And here's just a list of all the references I have for that. All right, Stephanie, all to you. Stephanie, sorry, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry, thank you.
There you go.
So one of the things that I noticed when I was going through all of the different articles was that a lot of them had a definition for performance-based budgeting, but they were just the littlest bit different. So in our textbook, he defines performance-based budgeting very simply just as the use of performance measures to make budget decisions. But a lot of other articles, some would focus more on the inclusion of strategic planning and strategic goals, and then focusing on the outcomes of those. Some would focus really on data and how the data was used to inform budgeting decisions. But for the purposes of our paper, I just wanted to summarize all of the different definitions as the inclusion of strategic outcomes and performance measurement data in order to inform and justify managerial and budgetary decisions. A lot of the definitions sort of left out the managerial part, but it seems that with performance-based budgeting, that's actually one of the main positives of it. So first, to look at the implementation of performance-based budgeting, I just wanted to start at the state level. So most states do have performance budgeting requirements, and those can come from either the legislative or the executive branches. So they are formally mandated to have those in place. But research shows that while that is mandated for them to have, it's not really having the results that people would like. And so in a survey by Willoughby and Melkers, it found that most budgeters reported that it was somewhat effective in improving agency program results and decision-making, that it had been less effective in reducing duplication and cost saving, and that it was really not effective at all in changing any sort of appropriation levels. And in addition to that, few states indicate that there was really any link at all between performance information and actual appropriations. At the local level, so at the cities and municipalities, there was a lot of the same sort of information. Actually, in difference to the sort of state level, there was no formal mandate for city and county governments to implement performance measures, but they just kind of did it on their own. And so this led to problems where there was sort of uneven implementation, and also it was not, like some cities were doing it, some weren't, some departments were doing it, but others weren't. And so it was really uneven and hard to track overall. Although some early surveys indicated that 60 to 80% of cities were using performance measurements, a 1999 survey found that 40% or fewer were actually using them for any meaningful purposes. And a later survey found that number might actually even be lower. So about 20% were actually adopting it the proper way. And 80% of municipalities were responding that they had not implemented performance-based budgeting or had not done so in any systematic way. So the problem with implementation of performance-based budgeting can come from various areas. The three main would be performance evaluation ability, personnel ability, or technical ability. So this goes back to sort of like resources of personnel, or even just how much it costs to implement a system like this. Additionally, at the state level, reform mandates are coming from both the legislative and the executive branches. So a lot of times, signals can get crossed, and there's not really like one way that the thing should be implemented. So there can be some confusion there. And then at the state level, there's really like no formal mandate at all. And then also with the different waves of popularity that performance-based budgeting has gone through, there have been like a series of implementations, whether partial or half-hearted, and then also abandonments, and then later a another implementation. So that could also contribute to problems without seeing the proper outcomes of performance-based budgeting. And in the end, if states lack the ability to measure performance in a way that people find useful, performance-based budgeting is guaranteed to fail at any level. Ultimately, though, performance-based budgeting leads to higher information that the governments can use in their decision making. Oh my gosh. While it might not lead directly to changes in budget appropriation, it certainly helps to inform the budget process and improve managerial decision making. And here are my references. And